In William Goldman's fabulous novel, The Princess Bride, Vizzini repeatedly expresses his disbelief by saying, "Inconceivable," to which Inigo Montoya eventually replies, "You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means." If I were to assert that a liberal arts education is where the path to a free and happy life begins, some may find themselves responding like Vizzini, thinking that such a claim is inconceivable. Or perhaps you might find yourself thinking similarly to one educator who, upon first hearing the expression liberal arts education, explained that his mind locked immediately on an unfortunate image. Liberal as opposed to conservative, arts as a euphemism for joblessness, and education as a hoop-jumping, time-passing exercise that consumes the first quarter of a person's life. Hi, I'm Scott Postma for Kepler Education, and in this two-part video series, I want to explain why I believe the path to a free and happy life begins with a liberal arts education. And in this first video, I want to explain the meaning of a classical liberal arts education and show its importance and benefits, namely that it has the potential to cultivate a wise and virtuous people whose resultant happiness produces a free and flourishing society. In the sequel to this video, I'll demonstrate how to obtain such an education. Now, before I set out to persuade you of my thesis, I'd like to start by debunking what is probably the most common objections to pursuing a liberal arts education. The first reason that many people find the pursuit of a liberal arts education is inconceivable is because the meaning is somewhat ambiguous and even sometimes negative. You know, those gen eds, as they're often called, those bothersome but necessary preliminary classes that a student has to take so they can get on with the important classes. Well, the second reason, and related to this first, is because attaining a liberal arts education is not utilitarian. In other words, a liberal arts education doesn't train a person to get a job. That's why they're considered bothersome but necessary. And a third objection is the natural end of the first two. If a liberal arts education is not directly going to help somebody get a job, then the expense is not seen as a worthy investment. But here's the rub. Show me a culture where education is directed toward job training, and I'll show you a culture whose God is greed and its people slaves to corporations, government, and vice. Sound familiar? Now show me a culture where human flourishing is the chief end of education, and I'll show you people who found nations, write epic poetry, explore space, give their life to missionary work, and in large, improve human existence. So let's get started by defining a liberal arts education, first etymologically and then experientially. The word art is derived from the Greek word techne, meaning craft or trade. Art implies the possession of a certain skill set, either endowed by nature, attained by practice, and usually by both. While craft and trade are accurate definitions of art in the classical sense, they're inadequate to qualify our meaning without employing the adjective liberal. The word liberal, which is derived from the Latin root libere, means freely. More specifically, the Latin adjective liberalis means freedom of free citizens, gentlemanly, honorable, generous, liberal, handsome. As can be seen from the etymology of the adjective, liberal refers to that which pertains to freedom, like a free person or a free society. In his book, The Life of the Mind, James Shaw aptly points out that certain disciplines, particularly what is known from Aristotle as metaphysics, are called freeing subjects. Such liberal discipline is undertaken for its own sake, that is, for the purpose of knowledge gained, not to do anything with, but just to know something is itself a pleasure. To say it another way, liberal refers to the kind of knowledge that liberates the soul of those who find pleasure in knowing for its own sake. Now, the word education is nearly as misunderstood as the word liberal because it is too often associated with job training. The English word comes from the Latin educare, and Shaw points out that the word educare means to bring forth or to complete something already begun by the very fact that one is a human being. In Platonic terms, education is the experience of being let out of or delivered from the cave of images that one is so able to see reality by the light of the sun and order his soul with virtue. Moreover, education is not only being able to see and explain what is real, but also to be able to explain the false views and know what it is to be unintelligent and vicious. In other words, to know both what is and what is not is a considerable part of being intelligent and virtuous. Education then is not job training, but the knowing of truth to the end that it brings forth wisdom and cultivates virtue within the person being educated. A general definition of a liberal arts education can be stated then as the pursuit and acquisition of that knowledge which is pleasurable for its own sake and which frees the mind and prepares the soul to be wise and virtuous. Next, let me explain the importance and benefit of a liberal arts education, namely how it has historically and consistently demonstrated its potential to cultivate this wise and virtuous people whose resultant happiness produces a free and flourishing society. In the 5th century BC, Aristotle wrote that it's evident then that there is a sort of education in which parents should train their sons not as being useful or necessary, but because it is liberal or noble. 300 years later, in the 2nd century BC, Cicero affirms the same thing, saying, "Yet I do at the same time assert that when a lofty, brilliant character is applied to molding influence of abstract studies, the liberal arts, the result is often inscrutably and unapproachably noble." Seneca, writing at the time of Christ in the 1st century AD, affirms this. He says, "When then do we educate our children in the liberal studies? It is not because they can bestow virtue, but because they prepare the soul for the reception of virtue." Basil the Great, writing and teaching in the 4th century AD, he also puts his stamp of approval on such education, likening the Christian's pursuit of it to that of bees taking pollen from flowers so they can make their honey. Here's what he says. "And since it is through virtue that we must enter upon this life of ours, and since much has been uttered in praise of virtue by poets, much by historians, and much more by philosophers, we ought especially to apply ourselves to such literature. For it is no small advantage that a certain intimacy and familiarity with virtue should be engendered in the souls of the young, seeing that the lessons learned by such are likely, in the nature of the case, to be indelible, having been deeply impressed in them by reason of their tenderness of their souls." Hugh of St. Victor, writing in the 12th century, believed that a liberal arts education was the kind of education that freed men from even needing to have a teacher. Here's what he said. "The ancients, in their studies, especially selected 7 liberal arts to be mastered by those who were to be educated. These 7 they considered so to excel all the rest in usefulness that anyone who had been thoroughly schooled in them might afterwards come to a knowledge of the others by his own inquiry and effort rather than by listening to a teacher." In the 17th century, Guillaume Baptiste Vico lamented to his peers that the greatest drawback of our educational methods is that we pay an excessive amount of attention to the natural sciences and not enough to ethics. As a consequence of this neglect, a noble and important branch of studies, that is, the science of politics, lies almost abandoned and unattended. He also stated that among the ancients, the teachings of rational, physical, and ethical doctrines was entrusted to philosophers who took good care to adjust those doctrines to the practical common sense that should govern human behavior. Elsewhere, he writes about the true goals of education, asserting that he who in these liberal studies is not seeking wisdom, that is, who does not cultivate these studies in order to improve his character and inform his mind with truth, his spirit with virtue, and his speech with eloquence, so that he becomes constant with himself as a man, and as much as possible able to help human society, is often other than what he professes to be. One way to summarize what all these quotations means is the liberal arts were never about job training. Rather, they were about the initiation of a pupil into the world of human achievement, to the end that a pupil might be wise. Watch for part 2, where I explain how one gets this kind of liberal arts education.